Fighters of the Pacific. This is a simple, very light war game. It is mainly two-player war game. One player will control the Japanese forces, one player the American forces. We are in World War II. We're in the Pacific, of course. It is mainly about aircraft action, but also with ships that show up in some of the scenarios. And it is scenario based, so a little bit sandboxy or water boxy. I don't know. There are scenarios you can also easily create around, so a lot of variety there. It is mainly a two-player game, but it can also be played solitaire by a single player controlling both sides at the best of their possibilities. And I played it in both modes. I played it solitaire, but I also played it against human opponents, which in this case were my daughters. Sometimes one of them at a time, some of the times the two of them ganging up against me, usually playing, they like to play the Americans, and then in those games I end up being the Japanese. So, this game is not... it's not being published yet. I think it's on Kickstarter right now, or it will be soon. The publisher asked me if I wanted to take a look, and I was curious about it. So I said yes, and they sent me the prototype that you see here. So 2 disclaimers are in order. 1, this is not the final copy. The final copy may look quite different. This is just a prototype. Second, although the game has not been released yet and is on Kickstarter or will be, this is not a paid Kickstarter preview. I don't do those. This is just one of my usual reviews. I play the game, I tell a little bit about how it plays, and then I tell you what I think about it. And that's just what I'm interested in doing, and that's what I do in all of my videos. Now, the board is modular, so that you will build it based on the instructions on the scenario, or using the scenario that you have created. The tiles are double-sided. They mainly show water, as you can see, but with some clouds, which can be very important actually, and also some islands on some of the tiles that you will use in some of the scenarios. We have our aircraft. There is a generous number of them, but there's a good number of them, so you can have some large scenarios, but there are 3 models per side. And the aircraft are represented by these tokens that are double-sided. The white outline represents the aircraft at high altitude, and the blue outline represents the aircraft at low altitude. There are only 2 altitudes, high and low. So these tokens will represent the actual position of the aircraft on the board, and when they're on the board, they always must be facing a specific hex side. The orientation matters a great deal here. And of course, let's also put some Japanese aircraft there so that it's fun. So we get a sense. There you go. And why not some of these little pesky zeros? It's not the Pacific without them. Let's face it. There you go. Each model is described on one of these players. They're really well done. Each model has a specific field of fire that, of course, you will take into account based on the position on the board. So the 0 has a field of fire that projects from the front and covers these 4 hexes in front like that. Other models have rear guns. There is an amount of speed. All aircraft in the game, or most aircraft in the game, have speed of 2, with the exception of our little fighters here, the 0 and the Wildcat. And then all aircraft have an armor of 2, which means it takes 2 hits to destroy them, with the exception of the 0. They have notoriously a brittle frame, and that's represented by the fact that a single hit will destroy them. They also have other keywords here that indicate some maneuvers that they can do, different things that they can do. But the general idea is very simple, very intuitive. Now, at the beginning of each turn, you need to determine who has the initiative, which is a key concept, which is predicated on another very important key concept, which is air groups. Units, aircraft in the game activate by air group. An air group is a group of aircraft which can be of any number, it can even be 1. The rules are, for an aircraft group is a group of aircraft that belong to the same player, are flying adjacent to one another, like in this case or this case. they're flying in the same direction and at the same altitude. So these three count as a single air group. There's another air group. These three now are two air groups. Also two air groups because they're not flying in the same direction. Also two air groups because they're not flying at the same altitude. So right now, the Japanese player has three air groups in play and the American player has one. Very important. At the beginning of the turn, we determine initiative. It sounds laborious, but it's very intuitive after a while. You count points. Each aircraft group that is flying at high altitude counts 1. Each air group flying at low altitude counts as 2. Each damaged aircraft, and you mark damaged aircraft by using these tokens here. If I can open the bag, otherwise there's no hope. Each damaged aircraft is really cool. Look at that. And you place them like that, and you see the smoke. If ships are in place, also that also feels very thematic. It's a very cool idea. Back to the idea of initiative. 1 point for each group flying high, 2 points for each group flying low, 1 point for each aircraft that is damaged. The player with the lowest total has initiative. And it will make a lot of sense because when you have fewer airplanes that they're flying in tight formations, there's better coordination, they're flying high, really get the sense that they have a better situational awareness. If there's a tie, the player that had the initiative the previous turn keeps initiative, and you use this marker to indicate which side has initiative. Again, initiative based on having fewer airplanes working together, flying in the same direction, forming tighter and high altitude aircraft groups. Then the player with initiative goes first, or does she? The idea is that the player with the initiative chooses if they themselves are going to activate an aircraft group or they're going to skip and give an activation to the other side. Basically, for the turn, the player with the initiative can skip as many times as they want. When they decide to activate a group, then they activate only one, and then the opponent activates one, and then goes back to them to decide if they want to activate again or skip again. So basically, the player with the initiative decides if they're gonna go, when they're gonna go, if they're gonna skip, how much they're gonna skip, and so on and so forth. So the American player says, okay, we have the initiative, you go first. Then the Japanese player activates an aircraft group. After they do so and they resolve the thing, goes back to the American player to decide whether they're gonna go or skip again, and so on and so forth, until all groups have been activated. When you activate a group, every aircraft in the group must activate, must move. You can't just stop in the middle of the sky, and they must move up to their full movement allowance. And you have a very efficient player right here that tells you how movement is resolved. An aircraft that moves needs to spend all the movement points, which again are 2 or 3. For a movement point, you simply can move 1 space forward. Let's use the zeros because they're really cool. For 1 movement point, you can move forward like that. For right in front of your nose, 1, 2, just like that. Or for a movement point, you can slide, which means you move in one of the 2 spaces forward, forward left, or forward right without changing orientation. Or for a movement point, you can turn, which means you're still moving into one of those spaces, forward left or forward right, but turning orientation by 1 notch. And so, for example, a legal movement for this one here would be 1, 2, 3, for example, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. Changing altitude, diving. So going from high to low, you move forward in the space right in front of you. You change altitude, and that's free movement. So that's your still has 3 movements available. If you're at a low altitude, to go up, to climb, you move straight ahead, you change altitude and that costs 2 movement points, and you cannot climb and dive in the same turn because it just looks silly. If your aircraft has the fighter attribute, then they can execute a move called the split S, which means if you're at high altitude, you execute a split S, you can end up at low altitude in any hex adjacent to the one where you are, with the tail facing the hex where you were. So that would be a split S. That would be a split S. So you really get the sense of like these crazy maneuvers that end up like that. So that would be the split S. Only aircraft with the fighter attribute can do that. So I move. And after I move, I may end up with my field of fire facing enemy aircraft. So if after an aircraft moves, there are enemy aircraft in the field of fire, then they are attacked. Then you get to attack with the aircraft that you just used to move. If they were already activated, just like so, after you activate an aircraft, you mark it, and that's super important. If they're already activated, that's it. They take a hit. In this case specifically, the 0 scores 2 hits in the X right in front of them, 1 hit around it, and that's it. So if you catch somebody unaware, you really got a sense of where they were because they activated earlier. You get there, booyah, and you score those hits. Again, a single hit is marked with one of these. In this case, 2 hits will destroy that aircraft, and the aircraft is removed. So if I place somebody that activated in my field of fire, I score a hit automatic. It's deterministic combat. In case they were not activated, like that is the case, they must attempt to dodge, which means they can move forward, they can turn, they can slide by 1 space, attempting to get out of the field of fire. And after they do so, they count as activated. In this case, for example, the field of fire again is here. This one hasn't activated. By moving forward, they dodge, they avoided that hit, but of course now they can't move. And that's how, for example, you can break aircraft groups, because you force them to dodge and scatter in all directions. And I feel like there could be a way for me to maneuver this airplane in position and then attack them and then destroy them. If after the dodge they're still in the field of fire, suppose that this is the situation, and I know they could dodge. They could dodge like that. Booyah, booyah. Oh, of course, whatever. I'm under 6. Now there is the field of fire of the 0 again is these 4 here. As an activated, so we'll attempt to dodge, but anywhere they dodge, they're gonna be in the field of fire. So if you're not activated and after dodging you're still in the field of fire, you're spent as usual after dodging, and you also take a hit. So again, deterministic combat. If you place your field of fire against somebody that already activated, that's automatic hit. If they haven't activated yet, they will attempt to dodge. That will always cost them their activation. They will always end up being activated. And if after they dodge, they are still in your field of fire, they also take a hit. Just as simple as that. That's how you resolve combat. There may be ships involved in the action depending on the scenario. At the end, and you can use a dive bomber, in which case the aircraft has that designation. They dive onto it and they unload the bomb, which causes some damage there. Torpedoes, really cool. If there is an aircraft with a torpedo designation, they can move straight at low altitude and drop the torpedo, and then the torpedo will move 1 or 2 hexes toward in a straight line until they hit something or they leave. At the end of the turn, basically, you will move the torpedoes that are in the water. You will move the aircraft. You will move the ships, and depending on the size, they move in different ways. They may move forward, they may pivot, trying to dodge those torpedoes. A lot of stuff going on. But the basic idea is still that each turn you determine initiative, then you will activate aircraft groups with the initiative player deciding who goes next, and they can choose to have the opponent go as many times as they want before they get to activate a group. Then again, they decide to have the opponent go up a number of times. But you continue this way, activate until everybody has activated. At that point, again, if there are ships and torpedoes in the water, things happen. The ships also may defend themselves because they count as having a field of fire that projects outside of the body. But the general idea remains the same. Fly around, form tight groups to gain initiative, scatter when needed, force the opponent to scatter, force them to dodge, take them down, inflict damage, and the winner will be the player that will score the most points based on the objectives of the scenario. The game is extremely light, extremely simple, as you are seeing. Deterministic combat resolution. Many of you are probably freaking out already. Deal with it. It is what it is, and I think this is a good game because I can only search my feelings and describe my feelings in my video reviews, and I enjoyed the game. I enjoyed playing it, and it's just as simple as that. To me, this is a good game because when I play it, I have fun. And that's the bottom line. Now, to give a little more detail of how we got there. Times of pandemic are times of exhaustion, and I probably appreciate the light games more now than I did a year ago. 2 years from now, maybe it'll be different. But as of now, I still like war games, but I also enjoy war games that get there with a very short set of rules. And here, basically, the core rules are 3 pages. We don't have the 2 pages about islands or anti-aircraft guns or torpedoes. We don't necessarily get involved, get activated in every scenario. So what you have is an incredibly minimalistic rule set. But to me it works. To me it works because, well, it's fun to play. Again, that's the bottom line. But also it feels thematic enough that I had the feeling, I had the sense that I'm playing a game about the topic here, not just a war-themed game. Of course, where do you draw the line between this game is war-themed but not really a war game, and this one is a war game? If I take tic-tac-toe and instead of circles and crosses, I use tanks and airplanes, that doesn't feel like a war game. Other games feel, but where is the line? Again, it's subjective. To me, this feels like a war game, and my definition is a war game is a game that when I play it, I feel like I'm playing a war game. And I feel that's the case. Again, probably too simple, probably too light for some of you. But there's enough theme here, for example, that I was able to show and teach some things about the Pacific to my daughters, who are now 8 and 10. They are happy to play this game with me, and that's no small accomplishment for the game to be so interesting and attractive to young players. And so we're talking about the Zeros that are so quick and so agile, and they hit so hard, but they also go down so fast because their frame is so fragile. Talk about torpedoes, how torpedoes work, and the American torpedoes in this game are slightly less effective than the Japanese ones. That is represented by different speed that they travel at. The American torpedoes in the game are a lot more effective than they were in the Pacific historically, but still, that's a small price to pay. So they're just elements of the or initiative. My daughters didn't know what the initiative was, and now they have a better sense of the idea of situational awareness, of having the initiative, having the momentum, having a better control of the battlefield. It's a very important concept in military warfare, of course, and it's also very important here. So it does allow you to see some of those dynamics of history at work, again, in a very broad sense, in a very broad brushstrokes, but the overall picture seems to work to me. And again, a game that I can play with children and they get excited about it, and I still get excited about it. That's pretty remarkable. And again, to me, the game also works well solitaire, which really surprised me because combat is deterministic. Usually for a game to work in solitaire fashion, when I control both sides, not against an AI, I need to have some randomness there. I need to be surprised. And I still am, despite the fact that it's deterministic. Meaning, yes, from time to time you can game the system. You can play like you can play some moves like chess or checkers. I know exactly that if I'm right there, this airplane will never. This turn absolutely has no chances of hitting me. On one hand, my initiative is like, but this is not a war game. There has to be some uncertainty. But then I think they historically there were cases where the enemy was far enough that you knew for the next couple of minutes you were safe. What happens next? Who knows? Because yes, you can game sometimes the position one hex or the next this turn, but you can't necessarily predict everything. You yourself realize, oh, wait a second, I didn't realize that if I climb here, if I dive there, if this side does that, I hadn't realized that this situation may emerge. So you may see next turn ahead, but maybe not 2 turns ahead. So I know exactly what's going to happen next turn, but it turns out that then by the play moves, there are certain combinations that emerge that I hadn't seen. And then, oh, surprise, surprise. When an aircraft dodges, then I have a choice, and depending on where I place it, different things may happen. So, although combat is deterministic, there were still many cases in which the deterministic nature of things led the aircraft to be not exactly where I thought they would be, or to open or close certain opportunities not exactly the way that I thought they would. And definitely, there's still interesting choices as you're trying to maximize your initiative. As you're deciding as the initiative side, how long you're going to wait, how many activations you're going to let them take before you go in. Because it's good to wait because they're activated. They cannot come after you anymore. Most importantly, if you go after them after they activated, they can't dodge, which seems very powerful. But as you go in, you leave yourself on cover to the next to be attacked next turn. So you want to go last and retain initiative. And yes, again, you can game it a little bit because I'm going to change the angle of that aircraft so that they count as a single air group. But you know what? I spent a lot of time playing traditional war games, spending a lot of time to look for that extra combat point that would give me to the 2-to-1 column on the combat table instead of the 1.5. And I don't think Napoleon really spent a lot of time looking for that one combat point. I don't think that commanders in the Pacific or in any theater ever look for that one extra point to get to the next column. So when we play a game, we game the game a little bit, we game the game system. The point is, if it gets to the point where you still see the theme past that gaming element, then you're playing a war game, you're playing a thematic game. And to me, that happened. I game the system in terms of getting that initiative handicap where I want it to be. I game the system because of the distances. But then overall, I still felt that I was playing a game with cool actions, with interesting actions, with surprising maneuvers, with beautiful maneuvers in a sense, seeing how the smooth action of the aircraft coming from different directions, forming a group that allows me to gain initiative and then splitting at the right time, or that I think is the right time, to go and gain certain advantages, then being scattered by enemies. So the initiative element is a very fun element here. It's really the key element of this design, and it works so well because it gives incentives to fly in certain combinations in certain elements of the game, to pay the cost of losing initiative by getting to take advantage of more complicated maneuvers. So the fluctuating level of initiative based on the fluctuating level of organizational chaos that you have in your formations, those are really fun elements, and they think they work very well. Overall, I cannot talk about the production because it's just a prototype. It may look very different, but for gameplay, and I think the elements of the rulebook, they will be cleaned up or tightened a little bit later. But from what I've seen here, this is at the very least a very promising package because I enjoy playing every scenario that came with a prototype. Mind you, it's only 3, but then my daughters and I will also start messing around with the components and start creating our own scenarios, which is very easy and fun to do. Sometimes a light war game is just what you need, or at least what I need. Here you have a game that you can play solitaire. You can play with kids. You can play with casual gamers, and it still feels like a war game, at least to me. There's enough theme here that I cared about the action, I cared about the narrative, I cared about the story, and there were just some interesting, tight, gripping action happening all the time as a ship is desperately maneuvering to get out of the trajectory of a torpedo. Even if you can count hexes and it'll make it still fun, still exciting. So definitely, I enjoyed this game very much. It's on Kickstarter now. It will be soon, or at some point if you watch this video later on when the game is being produced. I don't know. Take a look at it. Consider it, because definitely this prototype is a lot of fun to play, and I believe the final product with better production and more scenarios will be even more enjoyable.